Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The first story this week is about understanding why snapping turtles can hibernate under frozen lakes and survive with almost no oxygen. This is a very similar story to that about goldfish, who can practically survive without oxygen for extended periods. The researchers believe the turtle's ability to live for 6 months without any extra oxygen owes to hereditary changes to their genome. They believe that when developing as an embryo, the turtles are exposed to extremely low levels of oxygen and cold. This leads to changes in their heart and the rest of their body that makes them adapt to cold conditions with little oxygen. The problem with living in this environment is hypoxia, which is very similar to suffocation. It leads to muscle damage and damage to any other tissue in the body. The body needs to be able to remove waste material and provide nutrition. This is something that hibernation is especially adapted to. In the case of the turtles, they withstand the cold conditions with little oxygen that are necessary for life and maintain their metabolism and muscle function. Under other circumstances, this would not normally occur. The turtles commonly called the common snapping turtle are developed under conditions that would normally only have 21% of the normal oxygen content. This could get as low as 10% of the oxygen content. This is when they're developing as an embryo. This leads to lifelong modifications. And the important part here is that the modifications are not just for when the environment is cold and there is little oxygen. The researchers were able to isolate cardiac muscle cells. They were subjected to low levels of oxygen, and they found that it's retained functionality. But they then tried introducing normal oxygen levels. Now this should have caused damage to the cardiac muscles, because oxygen is relatively toxic. What they found was that at normal ambient levels, it didn't actually cause this damage. They believe that it owes to a series of genes that can be turned off or turned on in relation to the oxygen concentrations. Now, this is relevant to turtles, but it could also be relevant in the long term to human health. The ability to deactivate certain genes associated with heart damage could be an important avenue of investigation for cardiovascular disease. It's also an interesting investigation of an evolutionary adaptation and, at least in theory, hereditary change. Speaking of hereditary adaptation and evolution, a mysterious skull has been found in Greece that may shift one of the timings of the African migrations or the initial movement of humans from Africa to Europe. Evidence to date places the first major migration at approximately 160,000 years ago. These remains, if dated correctly and are anatomically accurate, would lead researchers to believe that it was 50,000 years earlier, or 210,000 years ago. The remains found in the caves are interesting for more than just dating reasons. There are two sets, called Apidema 1 and Apidema 2. Apidema 2 is a Neanderthal and is dated to about 170,000 years ago. Apidema 1, when reassembled, does not belong to a Neanderthal. In fact, it looks like a Homo sapien. That is the older specimen. Those two dates that are so far apart are one of the warning signs for this study, and most researchers who disagree with this conclusion are making that point, that it is very unusual to find samples so widely dispersed in the geological timeline. There is some theorizing that perhaps they came from another location, were washed into this location, and that was about 150,000 years ago. That's based on the sedimentary evidence. Further evidence that would help to cement this conclusion would include things like tools, other remains, or other evidence of occupation or use of that site by either Neanderthals, and or Homo sapiens. Speaking of development and evolution, Russian scientists say that they have 5 couples who have agreed to gene editing of babies. This is intended to resolve issues of hereditary deafness. Much like Dr. He in China, they plan to use CRISPR to create a gene-edited child, unlike Dr. He's work with the Chinese HIV babies. The deafness in these children will be caused by a very specific mutation in one of the genes called the GJB2 gene. Resolving this is much more specific and much more suitable to CRISPR than that done with the Chinese babies, and in theory, it is perfectly legal within Russia, and the rest of the world would struggle to stop them from doing it. As it stands now, the lead researcher behind it has yet to implement these treatments, and is working with the government to both do it legally and do it properly, unlike Dr. He's work, which has all the hallmarks of an unofficial and certainly unapproved operation, or at least the Chinese government claims as much. This Russian study is contentious for several reasons. First, CRISPR is reasonably unproven in this application. It's known to work in a laboratory setting. Long-term effects have not been as well understood as you might think. The argument against this is that these children would be living with a condition that is socially stigmatized and does to a degree deprive them of some opportunities. As a result, the treatment is being used to better their lives. This has in turn been countered by an argument that it is a form of genocide by removing a specific subset of the population. That position is less tenuous, as in theory they have a pathology that is being treated medically, and so the ethics of this particular study are becoming very murky very quickly, and it will be up to the Russian government to decide how best to either approve or implement such programs. Far less contentious is a decision by the UK government to extend the HPV vaccine to young boys. The HPV vaccine, or human papillomavirus vaccine, was originally brought out to treat young girls and prevent them from developing a range of cancers, particularly cervical cancer. But the virus itself does not only have this effect on women, it can cause a variety of cancers in men and young boys, as has been described previously. For a while, the UK had been arguing that if all women were vaccinated, then all men would be protected. This rather obviously ignored a reasonably small subset of the population, but one that could continue to be a reservoir of this virus. Going forward, they recognized this fact, and last year opted to provide the vaccine to those with those sorts of sexual orientations. Going forward this year, they've decided that a universal vaccine program is more appropriate. They will now treat it much like they would the flu, or, on a more accurate basis, measles, where you receive immunization early on in life in an attempt to eradicate the disease. Doing so will have substantial benefits to the public health sector. Specifically, the Public Health Service claims that by doing this, more than 100,000 cancers across the UK will be avoided by 2058, and 50,000 of these would be non-cervical cancers. In other health service related news, The Conversation put out an article recently describing the value and benefit of vitamin drips. These were IV infusions of vitamins. To cut a long story very short, there's no value to this if you are in a position to receive them. If you're not in a position to receive them, chances are your diet is inadequate anyway. There are claims that they can provide benefits to serious medical conditions: cancer, Parkinson's disease, macular degeneration, and so much more. things that modern medicine has some difficulty in controlling if it can, and in many cases, an adequate and long-term treatment has yet to be developed for. The human body is very good at regulating just how much of what it needs to be in circulation. What it can store, it will store, normally in adipose tissue, the liver, and a few other locations in the body. What it cannot store and what it cannot use, it removes very efficiently. The vitamin infusions are almost the exact opposite of claims for detoxing. The argument almost seems to be that if you are infused with an excessive amount of certain nutrients and vitamins, that you will get better. The detoxing argument has always been that they can miraculously remove unwanted things from the body. A detox diet or treatment is pretty much universal for what it is. The IV infusions are different in that each is supposed to be tailored to the needs of the person receiving it. As an example, some are creating a cocktail intended to boost the immune system by providing vitamin C and zinc. As has been described previously, on an acute basis, this does not provide the benefit claimed. The concept itself is not without medical reasoning. It's been used on a long-term basis for those who have significant digestive issues, Crohn's disease, and other GI tract problems such as celiacs that may impair absorption of dietary vitamins and nutrition can be overcome to a degree through this. Iron deficiency is another example, but as has been said, the body is very good at holding on to what it can use and what it needs, and removing what it does not. There are a handful of vitamins that it will struggle with, and you can get acute toxicity issues from these infusions. Vitamin A is perhaps the best example of this. The body only needs so much, but it's fat soluble. This means that all of the excess that you are given will then be put into fat cells. As those fat cells get broken down, for example during exercise when you are trying to lose weight, it will be released in a flush, and this can risk damaging organs, especially the liver, that is the leading means of removing unwanted compounds. Considering all of this, IV vitamin therapies are a terrible idea. They ignore most medical advice on sustaining a healthy lifestyle and instead attempt to force the body back into an equilibrium that it may not be normally at. This perceived equilibrium can lead to the damage of many organs, and those who are most likely to be using it, those who are particularly wealthy as it is not a publicly funded service, are also those less likely to need it. If you have existing medical conditions like kidney disease, hypertension, cancer, or anything else, doing this could not only cause more damage to your organs, put the body's biological system under excessive strain, but also interfere with the treatment you are receiving. You would get just as much benefit from eating healthy and exercising regularly as you would from an invasive medical procedure like IV vitamins. In other health-related news, Australian researchers have just released an AI-developed vaccine for the first time. While it's not Skynet developing a biological weapon, the drug was designed using computers that went one step further than most others in the past. As was described recently in a video on bioprospecting, the researchers were using an AI program that could go through a catalogue of compounds that were known to activate the human immune system. It could then discard those that it didn't think would work and find those that it thought would work. They then looked to see through animal testing if they could use this particular method to boost the efficacy of the influenza vaccine. As has been known in the last few years, the influenza vaccine has been a little bit of an unreliable product. Generally speaking, it's better to have it than not, that between 2017 and 2019 there has been an increase in both the regularity, the timing, and the severity of the flu virus. What the researchers have found through their work with animals is that their AI-designed vaccine has been more effective than the existing vaccines are. In Australia, where the researchers were originally developing their product, the number of incidences of influenza has doubled in most states. This has led to not only an increased number of diagnoses, but a massive spike in the number of people who have died as a consequence. This is despite many of them having received the current vaccine. The next bit of research is more a discussion about planet developments, and something scientists are trying to call ploonets. Ploonets seems to be the abbreviated form of protoplanet, these being moons around large gas giants that are eventually forced out of orbit and into their own gravitational well, eventually becoming a planet. Although not yet official, it's an interesting observation about how planets in our solar system could develop in ways other than accretion during the development of the Sun. In other and somewhat exciting news, the asteroid-jumping probe Hayabusa II has returned from Ryugu and brought with it photos and data from its attempt to bomb the asteroid. This endeavor was covered back in April, and the photos that were delivered were interesting. Hayabusa II has collected samples from the surface of the asteroid in the last few days, and come the end of the year, it'll be returning to Earth. Coming back to Earth and on a global scale, studies are investigating the effect that global warming might have on Earth, and particularly how cities will change drastically. They estimate that about 1 in 5 will have a climate that has never occurred on Earth before. The researchers used the most optimistic modeling method available that believes there will only be a small degree in temperature change. This small degree is about 3.5 degrees centigrade in summer and 4.7 degrees centigrade in winter. What they mention in particular is that doing this would be the equivalent of moving every city 1,000 kilometers further towards the equator. This leads to one small catch. 22% of the cities they studied are already around the equator or close enough that their conditions would change in such a way that the researchers lack a reliable analog for now, unlike the other roughly 80% of cities. This is important when you consider that the other 80% could be compared to data that already exists for other cities closer to the equator, things that have already been accounted for when designing cities in those regions can be applied. This could be infrastructure, power, services, but 20% will lack that particularly important data. While scientists are busy modeling just how exactly this would have an effect on not only the population but the cause, farmers in India are having to engage in what is being described as civil disobedience. The Indian government has put a moratorium on the use of genetically modified crops. This means farmers are unable to plant what are otherwise resilient, otherwise survivable, and generally more effective crops because the government will not allow it. As a result of this and the availability through less than reputable channels, farmers are getting their hands on the seeds and planting them in defiance. On June 10th alone, about 1,500 farmers gathered in India to illegally plant these plants publicly. The farmers have clearly stated what they're doing and why. As an example, they have planted BT brinjal, a particular eggplant species that is resistant to pests. Another is the herbicide-tolerant cotton seeds. These are staple crops for these farmers, and by planting a more effective variety, they will not only have to do less work, but they'll get more money back for what they plant, an important aspect for any farmer. The government is not necessarily doing nothing in regards to this. One of the other sites that was used for a previous act of civil disobedience has been burnt out. As a consequence of those actions, farmers who are both growing legally permitted crops and those who are engaging in civil disobedience are fundraising to support the farmers who have been affected by the government's decision to start stepping on these farmers and their ability to plant a crop that is safe, effective, and at the moment illegal for no rational reason. Anti-GMO activists are pushing the government to get the police to arrest those involved in these rallies and plantings. However, there seems to be some reticence on the part of the law enforcement agencies to arrest farmers, specifically because they understand how difficult life can be for Indian agriculture. There is one other aspect of this story that needs mentioning. Most of India bans GMO crops. However, Bangladesh does not have that issue, and in Bangladesh, thousands of small farms have adopted the BT brinjal. This has drastically reduced their pesticide use and also increased their profit margins. And the Indian farmers are asking the very simple and reasonable question of why can't we do the same? In another GMO-related piece of news, there is research showing that cows could be either selectively bred or genetically modified to significantly reduce their methane emissions. A large percentage of global warming could be put down to the presence of methane in the atmosphere. This has a greater greenhouse effect than CO2 does. Agriculture, and in particular meat and dairy production cows, are a significant contributing factor to this. They are responsible for about 14.5% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. Part of this, in fact a large part of this, owes to the amount of gas that a cow will belch out whilst it is eating grass. The bacteria in the cow's gut helps to break down the complex and often difficult to consume cellulose. By doing this, the cow can consume the grass and get a lot more nutrition from it than a human would, for instance. There are many possible options as to how cattle could be treated to reduce this issue. Other options include changing their diet to include seaweed. Another is to change the microbiome in the predigestive part of the cow's GI tract. Researchers believe that in doing so, they can get the cows to pass on a particular set of genes that would encourage the presence of a microbiome that will in turn reduce the amount of methane produced. The problem with this particular approach is that breeding cattle is time-consuming, and it would take decades to achieve the results desired. There is belief that genetically modified cattle could in theory achieve the same result in a decade or less. The final story this week is more a question of what? What does Oklahoma, a stolen car, uranium, a rattlesnake, and whiskey have in common? Take a few seconds to consider. Well, unfortunately, the police still don't know, despite having arrested a couple driving a stolen car with a box of uranium, a rattlesnake, and an open bottle of whiskey in it. Further to this, the driver of the vehicle had a firearm for which they were not approved. Strangely enough, for this story, uranium is not the illegal part. The snake is not the illegal part. It is in fact the stolen vehicle and the open bottle of whiskey. The car being stolen was an issue illegally, but driving with an open container of alcohol was also another crime that has led to both of these people being held for now. This is further to the fact that neither of them was legally allowed to have the firearm. Please put any suggestions you might have as to what they are up to in the comments section. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.